Nick, and the government are trying to stay neutral about bias.
Yeah, this is Downing Street denies having anti-BBC agenda after bias accusations. So Lucy Fraser was sort of grilled on this, and she said that, look, the BBC tends to be has a problem with impartiality, but she was kind of cornered on it, and she ended up saying, well, look, people perceive there's a problem, and that's enough. She said there are only perceptions, and perceptions are important. So she was backed into a kind of Descartes sort of defence of solipsism. It was quite strange. And then she was pressed to give actual examples. And annoyingly, for us, or me anyway, she couldn't really give any. She kept citing the attack on the hospital in Gaza as one example. But there were so many she could have given. She could have gone Brexit, she could have gone lockdown, she could have gone vaccine, she could have gone the whole of BBC Verify, which is an absurd joke. She could have gone failing to call Hamas a terrorist organisation. She could have gone Emily Maitlis's entire career. She could have gone the woman laughing about Boris Johnson was another classic example. So there are so many. It's not that hard. So it's
actually, the one she gave, I think, is pretty good.
It's good. She only had one, but it's
the Hamas hospital issue.
They trusted Hamas.
It wasn't just a mistake, because I saw the interview, and I think the interviewer, was it Kate Burley, said that it was a mistake. That's just a mistake. It's not just a mistake when you say that the Israeli, the IDF, are targeting medical staff. Yeah. That wasn't a mistake that would slip through. What I'm saying is the only reason it got through is evidence of bias, quite severe bias, I would say.
But the actual BBC guidelines mean that was bad journalism. That was not sticking to the guidelines on getting two sources to verify the information before you go with it. So the BBC already has guidelines in place to stop that happening,
right?
Which means it shouldn't be speaking to its bias. Now, you could then make an argument, well, why did it get through?
Right.
Maybe the bias. But they already have the system in place to prevent the bias.
But what about all of the things that Nick mentions?
Yeah, I mean,
long list.
I just love this story for actually making the government defend whether they're biased against the BBC. We're in this war of, like, you're biased. No, you're biased about my bias. How dare you be biased about bias?
The other part of this is really important, is Ofcom will be given more powers to investigate the BBC. And you go, OK, that's bants while we're investigating the BBC, and we've got the allegedly Conservative government. It's kind of mildly amusing, but it's going to be horrific when either this government, frankly, or especially Labour, get hold of these powers, start using them to limit free speech online, as we know is going to happen.
But also, I mean, if someone complains about the BBC, you can't complain directly to Ofcom. You have to complain to the BBC, and they decide whether they will pass your complaint on to Ofcom.
Yeah.
Surely that's a ridiculous system.
But if you're not satisfied with that complaint, you can take it further.
Yes, OK.
You just have to jump through that hoop first.
Speaking of impartiality, though, it's not the most impartial. Hello, I'd like to complain about the BBC. Hello, we're the BBC. It's completely absurd.
I mean, isn't the issue, and I've always maintained that it is quite hard for the BBC to remain politically non-partisan. It's actually a difficult tightrope to cross, and I don't want to bash them for that, because I do think it's hard. On the other hand, I think they have continually and singularly failed when it comes to the culture war issues. They're clearly on one side. They have written policies that are on one side. They have guidelines about how you shouldn't misgender rapists and criminals. That is taking a very firm side on the culture war, and that's that's a written document I've seen.
I mean, I've worked at the BBC and seen people bending over backwards to try and not be biased. But the problem is, how do you spot your own biases?
Right.
The problem is the BBC recruits from such a small group from society.
Yes.
There'll be some biases they don't know they've got, so they can't check.
Well, I think they're pretty clear, and maybe they should do something about it.